Hello and welcome to Mr. C's History Walks. Today I'm going on an interesting walk around London to see some significant statues of women. Why? Well, I read a rather shocking statistic the other day which said that just 2.6% of all the statues in the UK are of non-royal women. Obviously there's quite a few of Victoria, etc., but women who are not members of the royal family, only 2.6% of the statues in the UK are of women, which is terrible. But because it's International Women's Day, I wanted to go around London to see which ones I could find that I think are the most significant statues, and definitely of some extremely significant women. So let's get going. Now, out of all of the statues of women in London, I think this one definitely is my favourite. Technically, this is the memorial to the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, spies essentially in World War II. They were sent on missions to sort of sabotage things like they did the Telemark in Norway, where they ruined machineries, etc. And one of the key things they also did was support the French resistance, who would cut telephone lines and destroy railways, etc., etc., etc. And this specifically is a bust of a woman called Violette Sasbo, who was joined indeed the French resistance. She was half French, half English, had an affinity with both countries. After her husband died in fighting World War II, she decided to join the SOE and go and support the French resistance. She did a mission, very successful, but in that first mission she unfortunately hurt her ankle. She sprained her ankle, which would be significant for her second mission. She took her second mission into northern France on the 10th of June 1944, just after the Normandy landings, and she was driving along and she got pulled over in a roadblock by the Nazis. She got found out and she had to run for it with a gun. But remember, of course, she had her weak ankle, and indeed she twisted it again, fell over, but she managed to, I think, hide in sort of a copse or a bit behind some trees or something. And she fired back for a good couple of hours, apparently, and killed several Nazis with that. Eventually she was captured. She was taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and unfortunately she was executed aged just 23. But what a significant woman. And I'm so pleased that there she is memorialised here. Lambeth Palace just behind her, the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm looking at the House of Parliament. Very, very, very prominent place. And isn't it wonderful that this brave, courageous young woman is celebrated in this way? This is the iconic statue of Buddika, or Boudicca, as she's also sometimes known, the Queen of Iceni, the Queen of the Britons. Why is she here? What's her story? Well, she is a real British heroine. She, of course, led a Roman revolt against the Roman rules. She ruled the Iceni tribe, which is based in sort of East Anglia, Norfolk area. And actually her husband died, Prestigius, and left the king with no heirs, no male heirs. She had two daughters who are with her on the statue there. He died with no male heirs, so he left the throne half in her control, the other half he gave to the Emperor Nero of the Romans, saying, with the vain hope that they would leave them alone. Of course, the Romans didn't, and took and annexed the entire kingdom, the kingdom of Iceni. Now they were not having it, so they marched down. They took Colchester, they took St Albans, and they came down to London. And apparently 70,000 Roman legionnaires were killed by Buddika and her Iceni tribe, amazingly. They eventually, unfortunately, lost in battle, and it said she either died of shock at the loss or poison, or something like that. But little is known. It's quite a long time ago, of course, now. But it's amazing. She stands here looking at the House of Parliament, leading her way with her daughters. They're just a real symbol of strength within all. And of course, England is very, very famous, synonymous with its female monarchs and how significant and how powerful they are. Buddika is definitely the first and one of the most significant. Easily missed, just here behind me on top of Victoria Palace Theatre, is the wonderful statue of Anna Pavlova. You could easily walk past and never see this. What I like about her as well, she looks over the chaos here, but anyway, she of course was a Russian ballerina born in St. Petersburg, famously went across a lot of adversity. She was too tall, she had not strong enough ankles, flat feet, all sorts of things, to become one of the most famous ballerinas there ever has been. Now this theatre, the Victoria Palace Theatre, was opened in 1911 by a man called Alfred Butt, who was one of the key supporters of her career, and he put a statue of her. Apparently there are 5 statues in London of Anna Pavlova. I can't seem to really find many of them, but here's one of the, of course, the main one. The interesting thing about this statue is during World War II, they took it down because they were worried that they might get destroyed by the Blitz. Fair enough. But they know they got lost. It was never returned, presumably melted down for metal, I don't know, but it never came back. So this statue, in the end, when the theatre was first rejuvenated in 2006, they built a new statue of her. So that's actually relatively new, but based on an old thing. But as I say, this area has had so much redevelopment. It's still going on now. There's machines and all sorts of things banging around. She just looks rather elegantly watching over the madness. I think it's quite profound. Here in Waterloo Place is, of course, the Crimean War Memorial, but there is a statue here to one of the most famous women in British history, Florence Nightingale, our first nurse on our list. She, of course, famously was a nurse during the Crimean War in the early 1850s. And the statue is quite interesting one. She was known, of course, as the Lady of the Lamp, and she is indeed holding her lamp there. That's because she used to go around. I think it's a Longfellow poem where it really started to immortalise that she would go see the patients in bed, holding the lamp, of course, as you can imagine. Also, there's some interesting reliefs on the bottom of the statue of the scenes in Scutari Hospital. She set up, well, she didn't actually set it up, but she went to work at Scutari Hospital. Now, Scutari is just the other side of the Bosphorus in Istanbul, which is where many of the patients who were injured or wounded in the Crimean War, just to the north, well, quite far north in the modern-day Ukraine, facing down to the south, where in Istanbul, where she was based. Now, when she arrived in Scutari Hospital, she was appalled at the conditions, and indeed many of the men were not dying of wounds because of battle. They were dying of disease from being in terrible conditions. It didn't help that the hospital was built on a sewage dump, so you can imagine part of the issues of that. She would therefore adamantly push forward that there needed to be reforms in sanitation. Men needed to be properly fed. They needed to be cleaned. They needed to be able to help write letters home, etc. The whole idea of nursing, this modern nursing idea, came through with her. Now, she was a relatively well-to-do woman, born in Florence, hence the name, and so she pushed forward this idea of modern nursing, which before that it was really just the preserve of nuns and mothers, and not really professional in many ways. Anyway, she returns back from Crimea, very ill herself, but she does return back a hero, and she pushes forward many of her social reforms. One of, as I said, is this professionalization of nursing. The idea of actually women in the workplace full stop. She was really a great symbol of that, hugely significant. She pushed forward abolition, or strongly promoted the abolition of prostitution laws that were detrimental to women, and she gave women who were prostitutes in London lots of support and help through her foundations, through her hospitals, etc. So a really pioneering woman. She is also the first ever woman to be given the Order of Merit. I think only 8 women have been since ever from the monarch. So an extraordinarily significant woman, and she stands proud here in Waterloo Place. Well, I'm just outside St Thomas's Hospital, and here is another quite new statue. It is of Mary Seale, famous, of course, for being a nurse during the Crimean War. Now, we've just gone to see Florence Nightingale, and there's a lot of comparison between the two, which I'll talk about in a minute. But first and foremost, who was Mary Seale? Well, she was a Jamaican nurse. She came from Jamaica. Her father had been a British-English sea captain, going around the Caribbean. Father's a child with a local woman. Fine. She had Mary Seale had a very adventurous life. She was in Panama. She was in Britain as well. She had learnt some traditional medicine through the military, working with soldiers, etc. But she'd also learnt a bit of homeopathy and just general caring for people. There's no suggestion that she was actually very formally trained as a nurse, but there were lots of people at those times who called themselves nurses who were not formally trained. That was not unusual. Anyway, come by the 1850s, she gets to Europe and she decides to volunteer to help in the Crimean War. Now, she went to visit Florence Nightingale in Scutari, in her hospital in Scutari in Istanbul, and apparently the one reference we have of the meeting is from Mary Seale's book. Apparently, it was perfectly fine. There was nothing necessarily untoward. I don't think Mary got the job with Florence Nightingale, but there's no suggestion that they didn't like each other. Anyway, Mary didn't stop there. She actually went to the battlefields, to Balaclava, just behind Sevastopol as well, and she set up a sort of, you might call it a hotel. Some people might call it a hospital. It wasn't. Some people might call it a restaurant, whatever the case may be. But it was very close, just behind the battle lines, and soldiers, British soldiers, could go in there for a cup of tea, a nice meal, maybe a sleep and rest, and maybe she might tend to a few of the wounds. The really serious, gravely ill, of course, went to see Florence Nightingale in Scutari. So she's amazing. She was there at the front line, actually tending to soldiers who were there, and she was doing the loving and caring bit as well, not just the medical patching up. She eventually came back to Britain, had a long life, and she became a masseuse to Princess Alexandra or something like that. Anyway, she dies in the 1870s. And unfortunately, she's largely forgotten, really. Not much is ever mentioned of her, again, until about the 1970s, when her fame becomes more known. And there's obviously now much more of a revisionism about the impact she has had. Now, let's talk again about that relationship with Florence Nightingale, because there are some people who like to try and drive a wedge between these two and say they were rivals, and many people also seem to say that Mary Seacole is seeking to outstripping the legacy of Florence Nightingale. I have no truck with that. One true thing maybe is this: where we are now is a bit of a odd decision to put Mary Seacole here, because St Thomas's Hospital was set up in part by Florence Nightingale, so it is a bit interesting that it's positioned here looking straight on Parliament, but be that as it may. But it's a lovely statue, isn't it? It's got the big disc around the back is actually a relief of the ground where Mary Seacole's restaurant, hotels, hospital, nursing station thing was. It's like bumpy bits of ground. Extraordinary, that. And there's a great quote out there by our friend William Russell, of course, who we saw his grave. We saw in the Brompton Cemetery video. Great quote, because he was met with her several times. Anyway, so leave that up to you what you think. I don't think there's much about the whole division and the rivalry between Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale. They were both great women who both deserve a statue here in London. I'm just to the north of Trafalgar Square, just behind the National Portrait Gallery, and importantly, I'm just behind where the original location of the Red Cross was, because I'm here with the statue of Edith Cavell just behind me. Edith Cavell was another nurse. We've had quite a few nurses so far, Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale, and here is another one, and she's obviously famous for her act of sacrifice that she took place in World War I. She had been born in England, in Norwich, in fact, and then she had moved to Belgium in about 1907, and she worked in hospital there, and she essentially became a patronised Belgian person. The Germans obviously occupied her during the First World War. She carried on working as a nurse, working in hospital. Come the First World War, she says that she is also going to treat Allied soldiers, British soldiers, in her hospital in occupied Belgium. This would have contravened German laws, and indeed it says on her plinth there, it says, "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness to anyone." So she said, whoever the patient was, whether they were German or British, I will treat them. The Germans didn't like this, and so they decided to imprison her, and indeed they went to execute her. Her trial and arrest caused international outrage, and the British tried to put pressure on the German government to not do it. The Americans got heavily involved. There were letters sent from celebrities at the time, but to no avail. The Germans felt that she was actually passing messages on and stuff like that. They treated her like a military combatant. Anyway, as it says there, she was shot at dawn in Brussels on October the 12th, 1915. What is interesting about this, the reaction was strong. It galvanized the war effort. It painted the Germans as even worse than they had been portrayed before, and it galvanized it more and more, this hatred of the Germans by the British. So I'm glad she's got a memorial here. It was opened in 1920, just 5 years after her death, and there is a little statue at the top of the Virgin Mary and Child as well, actually, again, of this sacrifice. But another very, very significant woman, and very importantly, a significant nurse. This is a statue of Emmeline Pankhurst, of course. Now, those of you who've seen my Emily Davison video, you'll know all about the strategies of the suffragettes. And it's worth talking a little bit now. We're in Victoria Path Garden, just to the side of the Houses of Parliament. She was actually originally down in the further south. They moved her closer here in the late 1950s. It's a rather beautiful statue. There's on the base, there's a little sort of badge there, which is what the WSPU prison badge. WSPU obviously standing for the Women's Social and Political Union, which Emmeline set up in her campaign for suffragettes. And just on the other side down here on the plinth is a little relief of her daughter's face, Christabel. Who was Emmeline Pankhurst? Why has she got a statue? Well, of course, she was the leader of the suffragettes, this women's social and political union. And their policy was deeds, not words, which means you do things in order to achieve them. And these things could be potentially violent. Bombing, burning things down, smashing windows, starving yourself, things like that, chaining yourself to railings. Action, action, action. Did this get the vote? We're off to see Millicent Fawcett next after this, who took the words approach instead, trying to do it through the political means and making speeches, etc., etc., etc. I personally am more on the word side of things. I think non-violent protest is more effective than violent protest, in my opinion. But there are others that might disagree, and there are historians who say who were more significant, the suffragists or the suffragettes. Perhaps you can let me know. But let's go and see Millicent Fawcett now. I'm going to end here in Parliament Square with one of the newest statues on my list, that of Millicent Fawcett here. Now, she's looking at the House of Parliament of Big Ben because it's very profound and impactful that she's here, because she campaigned for women's suffrage, the vote for women. Notably, she was a suffragist, which is different, of course, from Emmeline Pankhurst, who we've seen, who's more of a suffragette. More on that in a moment. But she had quite a long life, a long political life, and she always did it through peaceful means. The suffragettes were prepared, like in my Emily Davison video, and indeed with Emmeline Pankhurst, they were prepared to get the vote through violent means, through bombing, through taking down the King's horse, to general violent protest. Millicent Fawcett was not, and she formed a society called the National Union for Women's Suffrage Societies. I always get that wrong, but they campaigned through peaceful means. They didn't stop during World War I, they did it through peaceful means, and indeed most women, some women got the vote in 1918. It took a long, long time afterwards. But in 2018, the 100-year anniversary, they put this up. And Theresa May, the Prime Minister at the time, also a woman, very, very poignant, very, very symbolic, of course. She was here to unearth it. And it says on there, courage calls to courage everywhere, which is a famous speech that Millicent Fawcett made. And she's not the only one commemorated, because there's a band along the bottom there of about 42, I think, women, and a couple of men as well, who also peacefully campaigned for the vote. This, I think, is a very good place to end, because as I started off with that ridiculous statistic of how many, so few statues in London there are of women, there needs to be more. And here is a prime example of new ones coming in right in a very profound place, Parliament Square. Sorry, Millicent was very, very popular there. Just say, I hope you enjoyed this tour of London's female statues as much as I have. Let me know if I've missed any out. I may do another one, of course, because there are some more that I've not mentioned, who you think perhaps should be commemorated by statue, maybe where. Thanks very much for joining. I hope you have enjoyed yourself, and I'll see you on the next one. Don't forget to subscribe.